Hello and welcome to the Worn and Wound podcast. My name is Zach Kazan. I'm the editorial director at Worn and Wound. Joined today once again by Liam O'Donnell, Worn and Wound's videographer. Liam, how's it going?
I'm good. Thanks for asking.
It's great to have you here. Happy Monday to you. We're recording this early in the afternoon on a Monday. With that fresh energy heading into, as we speak, we're heading into Thanksgiving week. Always a hectic
Turkey week,
but fun week. Turkey week. Do you like turkey? I'm not a big turkey guy, but.
No, to begin with, no.
Yeah.
Turkey wasn't my jam, but I've had it served in a number of different ways since moving to the States, and so I think I've changed my stance on turkey quite a lot. Most recently, I had it deep fried for Thanksgiving, and that was pretty eye-opening. Yeah,
a fried turkey really will change your opinion on turkey, I think. This is well-trod territory, but I always do love seeing the videos of people kind of like exploding their deep fried turkeys in their driveways or whatever because they haven't let it completely thaw. And just like doesn't get much more American than that, blowing yourself up, frying a turkey on Thanksgiving. We love it. But anyway, today we're talking about, the main topic is going to be our favorite non-Swiss watches. We thought we'd each identify a handful of watches that do not originate in Switzerland, the cradle of the watch industry, just to kind of like talk about, kind of like the nature of Swiss made and what that means to us, and point out some alternatives. Obviously, there's many, many alternatives to Swiss made watches. We don't shy away from that ever on Worn and Wound, but we thought it would be fun to kind of like explicitly highlight some, and also just kind of like talk about what we think as collectors of kind of like the meaning in 2025 as of right now of Swiss made and the importance or lack of importance of that. We're also going to talk about a couple of new releases from the last week or so from Omega and Tudor. Big releases, new watches that I think have been pretty hotly anticipated, and I think mostly pretty warmly received. So we're going to get into that as well. But before we do that, of course, we'll do a wrist check. Liam, what are you wearing today?
As always. So today I'm wearing the Monta Triumph. It is
nice.
one of the very early models that I picked up very early on in my watch journey. I love it. It's kind of one of the best, I think, field watches that you can get for the price.
Yeah. Those early Montas are really nice. That brand is kind of like, they've subtly kind of shifted their approach a little bit, I think, in the last few years, but the early watches still have a ton of charm. So that's a very cool piece. I'm wearing a vintage watch today. I don't normally, I used to own a lot more vintage watches. I picked this up earlier this year in Chicago at the Wind Up Watch Fair. It's a Favre Luba chronograph. It's made by Heuer. It's an OEM, product for Favre Luba. It's cool. It has a black coated case that's kind of like fading and chipping in the way that they sometimes do after 30, 40 years. Looks really cool. It's like kind of the only patina that I really love. We'll throw a picture of it in the show notes. I don't wear it often enough. It's a really, really cool watch and feels very contemporary, even though it's from I think it's from like the early 80s. So
cool.
Yeah, and it still like runs great. It's just a chronograph Volge 7750 movement.
So
yeah,
staid movement. It's a workhorse.
For sure. All right, before we get into our non-Swiss chat, we have to address a couple of new releases from two brands that are very Swiss, Tudor and Omega. Tudor released a new version of the Tudor Ranger in 36 millimeters, and they added a what they're calling a dune white colorway to the lineup. And the 36 millimeter size includes the black version as well. It's been out for a few years now. So just a line extension and a new size and a new color. And Omega released the 4th generation Seamaster Planet Ocean, which is a pretty radical redesign of the Planet Ocean, a watch that a lot of people have a lot of really pointed opinions on. I've found over the last week or so of reading reactions to these watches. What do you want to start with, Liam? The Tudor or the Omega?
Let's go with the Tudor.
Okay. What are your kind of key takeaways from that? And what'd you think of the watch when you saw kind of like the first photos of it?
I was just revisiting some of the press images that they circulated of the watch, and I have to say that it's like a little overbaked
You
based
think so?
on what I've seen thus far. Like it just seems extremely over edited and unnatural.
Mm-hmm.
And that just always rubs me the wrong way. Like I feel like if you're going to, you know, take all of the saturation out of the case, it just makes the watch look like it's been copy and pasted into an image. And like I understand, like I feel like I have done that when I first started editing photos of watches, like wanting to make the case look a very, you know, gray, white, as opposed to sort of reflecting the colors of the environment that it's in. But they took all of the color out of it, and it's sitting in this very, you know, terracotta ochre kind of color environment, and it shows none of that in the bracelet or the dial. And I think that's just strange to me. I think that's a very gross misrepresentation of that watch, even if it is brushed. So yeah, just side note on the images that I saw. But I think, you know, as far as the release of the watch, I think it's great. I think it's a beautiful Tudor. I feel it really embodies their DNA as making great tool watches that sort of blend seamlessly between being actually in the environment they're designed for and in everyday life as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I would easily buy one tomorrow if I was offered and had the means to do so. So yeah. I think it's a great watch.
It's interesting to hear your take on the images themselves because you're a very talented photographer, and I know you think about these things a lot. I think a lot of times just casual observers might not fully understand what they're looking at when they're looking at like a brand's images of a watch. Like what percentage of an image is an actual physical object that they photographed versus essentially a render that's been, you know, like edited to the point where it doesn't actually resemble the physical object that the, you know, image is derived from. Mm-hmm. You know, and we see these things all the time working in watch media, and I think we just kind of like have gotten used to it, you know, to the point where it's just sort of like, you know, like acceptable.
Yeah.
But no, it really is something that like people should keep in mind, is that when they see like the images of the new Tudor Ranger on Tudor's website, or they're like reading our article, which we did not have, you know, hands-on access to this watch before writing it. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, but in this case we didn't. You know, we're using the, you know, like the images from the brand's perspective, like exactly what they want to kind of like show the world. And a lot of times that's like not an accurate picture of what the watch will look like in the metal.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. Now, there's some brands that do it really well, and I feel like they do the real product that you hold in your hand justice. And it doesn't feel like, you know, to make a comparison, watching a trailer for a movie that doesn't accurately reflect the movie when you go and watch it. You know, it gives you a different sense of the ending or sort of the climax, but it's not in any way like that at all. So I feel like these images to me are misleading in that sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, so.
But you like the as far as like the 36 millimeter size, you're a fan.
Totally.
Of that.
Totally. I have I'd say I have medium-sized wrists, and so 36 millimeter to me is it's a little on the smaller side for me. But given that this is quite a robust tool watch, I think it's perfect. It kind of compensates for being just at that number of 36, because as we all know, numbers don't necessarily mean anything relative to sort of the ratios of everything in the watch itself. You know, You could get a 36 millimeter watch and it could wear much larger or much smaller. I mean, the Doxa Sub 300 is a good example. You know, it has such a small dial, but it's like a 45 millimeter case, but it wears so comfortably and doesn't look big on the wrist. So I feel like, you know, the Tudor does that as well with these, you know, smaller ranges.
For sure. Yeah, I think that the 36 millimeter size for this watch just seems really obvious. Like it's when I remember when the larger watch came out a few years ago, they had a big launch event. Zach Weiss was there. We can put a link to his coverage in the show notes. Everyone kind of was like, why is it so big? It's like this watch kind of like naturally, you know, inclines itself to a smaller size because it's based on the historical Rangers, and the watches that, you know, predated the Ranger and Tudor's lineup were smaller. They were 34, 35, 36 millimeter watches. And it's just the type of watch that makes more sense, I think, at that size, being that it's so kind of like vintage influenced. Yeah. And yeah, it just makes sense. And like to your point about wrist size, like I also have a, you know, like a medium to large size wrist, and, you know, the larger Ranger like doesn't make sense, you know, on my wrist. Like this watch is kind of like the profile of it, the way it's meant to be worn just kind of like calls out for a smaller
size,
regardless of your wrist size, I think.
Yeah, totally. And I think that there is no hard and fast rule when it comes to sizing. This is just an opinion. I don't think it has to adhere to that. I don't think if it is a certain size or not makes it any less legitimate as a watch, more or less. And I just think that being the DNA of what it is, it's a field watch for the most part. And I think that, watches, the function of that watch is to sort of tell you the time and be very easy to read very quickly, but also not get in the way.
Right.
It's just there as a companion, but not sort of someone to sort of take up, any of the spotlight. So I think going any bigger than sort of 36, 38 is kind of really going against the DNA of a field watch.
Yeah, no, for sure. Any thoughts on the Dune White color?
I like the colors. Yeah, I think they're cool. It's more interesting than just white. It's more interesting than just black. And I've always had a soft spot for sort of earth tone colored watches, the IWC Mojave being one of them.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So this kind of scratches that itch for me as well.
There's this whole kind of like class of these like sort of desert, watches. Like the Mojave is a good example. That you've got this watch. There's a bunch of others that have come out in the last few years that kind of like conjure a certain, kind of like desert exploration vibe, for lack of a better term. Like I don't know if I don't know if that's like even a real thing or if it's just sort of like an invention of the watch. I mean, of course it's a real thing, but I don't know that folks who are, like working in the desert or exploring the desert are wearing watches that are, colored like the desert necessarily.
Yeah.
So it's like an interesting like marketing trick, but I do like this color a lot. It just like, it just kind of like works, it works.
I feel
for
like
this
it's
type of
a
watch.
Civilian's romanticized version of what something someone would use if they were working in the desert, whether it was military or mercenary work or like, I don't know, I just feel like it kind of fits whatever that image is in people's minds.
If you're a mercenary, imagine you're a professional mercenary and you you have to you get called for a job in the desert and you're like, I gotta pick my desert colored watch, and then next month you're going to the jungle. It's like, well, it's time for a green watch now. And it just keeps like, you have to keep it consistent. So
it's all about the light and sound discipline, in military circles. It's making sure that your watch doesn't give you away.
No, it's listen, these are practical tools, as we as we've said. All right, so we'll link to our Tudor story on the website. I think it's a cool release. It seems to be getting a lot of positive feedback online. A watch that I think has gotten more mixed feedback is the new Seamaster Planet Ocean. So Omega released, they had been teasing for a little while a new Planet Ocean, and man, like they delivered a brand new Planet Ocean that is like a genuinely kind of like radical rethinking of what the Planet Ocean could be in terms of its kind of like proportions and shape. And we'll link to this story as well. The thing that I pointed out in the article that I wrote is that regardless of whether you like the design or not, and I don't know that I have like I don't know that I've landed anywhere. I'm curious to know how you feel about it.
Yeah.
I think that Omega deserves credit for actually trying something a little bit different with this. Like their sports watches, the Speedmasters, the Seamasters, they follow like a certain format. Like you're going to get a case with those lyre lugs, that has a certain profile, certain size. They all kind of like look a certain way. And that's pretty standard in, like this tier of sports watches. It was familiar with like the Rolex, the Oyster case, like all these cases kind of like look alike,
right?
From within a brand's catalog, and Omega took the opportunity to really do something pretty different with the Planet Ocean this time around. And if you look at like historical Planet Oceans going back to whenever it was introduced in the late 90s, early 2000s, like they kept that format, they kind of just looked like beefier versions of the regular Seamaster in a lot of ways. This, to me, when I first saw it, I thought this actually looks more like a Zenith Defy in a lot of ways. It has like this like angular case and like stubby lugs, and the goal here, I think, was to create a more compact watch that maintains all of the professional kind of like diving features. It's still 600 meters water resistant. They've lost the helium escape valve, which a lot of people, are applauding, but I think it still has it's still, appropriate for saturation diving because of the way the case is constructed. It's a 2-piece case.
Right.
So it's also a flat crystal. It's thin. It's considerably thinner than the previous version.
Yeah, 3 mils, I think.
Yeah. Which is like not a small amount when you're talking about, a watch, with these specs. So early indications are that it's just a lot more wearable.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the new Planet Ocean? And did you have like thoughts on the old Planet Ocean? I'd be curious to know like kind of like what your thoughts are on this collection in general.
Yeah, no, I think it's a clean slate for this family of watches within Omega, rather than sort of like an incremental update. I think that's really cool. I think it takes a lot of risk to sort of reinvent a line of watches that have had a storied history. So I think, I applaud Omega for doing that. It's kind of risky to do something like that. I think it's very bold in the sense that it has, as you said, very stubby lugs, very flat angular planes, similar to a, like a GS, these large polished planes, which I think is really cool. It makes such a large watch feel just a little less busy, having these large flat planes, because there's a lot going on the dial. It's very busy. I think targeting, sort of a more wearable watch, I think is also a great idea. And then, if you're able to make it thinner by removing a component, but sort of addressing the same issue by using a different technology, I think that's also great. I think that's what innovation is. And yeah, I think it's still, like you said, hits all of professional sort of requirements, which I think for a lot of people who would wear this professionally, not that many people do anymore these days, but if you're ticking those boxes, it does that. And I'm a fan. I think it's great, especially for the price. It's 6-7, I think, Swiss francs, thereabouts. And I think, this could quite easily be sort of a future icon for Omega in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how it kind of how it continues to be perceived.
Yeah.
Amongst consumers. You make an interesting point that it's their professional diver's watch, but this is not going to be worn largely by professionals. It's going to be worn by people who walk into an Omega boutique or an Omega authorized dealer, and they want like the coolest, highest end, newest thing. And they're going to see this and they're going to get, the Omega representative or salesperson is going to, they're going to be good at kind of like explaining all the features and like the cool technologies, behind this watch. All Omegas are, packed with technology. Like, the movements are very advanced. This movement is Meta certified and, all the bells and whistles and everything. And the pricing. So they started in US dollars. It's about 8,600.
Okay.
And the highest spec version, which is the orange bezel on a bracelet, the orange costs more than the black and the blue because apparently it's more challenging to produce the orange ceramic. But even that version is under 10. And I think that like that's important because they probably like if Omega is often kind of accused of like kind of going after like the Rolex market and artificially increasing their prices to kind of like more closely like compete with Rolex. And I think that like they could have done that here. They could have priced that like high spec one like $2,000 or $3,000 more
for sure,
and people would have just had the normal kind of like eye roll sort of moment, like, well, of course this is a $13,000 watch. But I think the fact that like it comes in under 10 seems like we're still talking about a lot of money, but it seems like fair to me for what this is. Like their top of the line professional diver. Is like it feels like a value proposition, and I hate using that term, but it does kind of feel that way compared to some other divers like in this class. Like this doesn't scream to me like, oh, it's so expensive. I just didn't get that sense.
I'm with you on that. I feel exactly the same way. I feel like with Grand Seiko sort of moving more up market, pricing a lot of their watches sort of 95 to 12.
Yeah, what does the Grand Seiko diver go for? Like, what do you know off the top of your head what that retails?
I know if it's an Evo 9, it's somewhere in sort of the 8 to 10 range.
Okay,
so I think they're all sort of playing in that same field for or competing for those same customers. Though they don't really have, I think, to me, like their divers just don't kind of hit the same way that these do. To me, they seem too close to like a top of the line Prospex or Marine Master or something like that. They just don't feel premium enough for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I've handled plenty of them myself. So to me, I feel like, this is a great value proposition for what you're getting in terms of finishing, materials, R&D, prestige. There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for what you're getting in this package for $8,600.
Yeah, I made that. I pointed that out in the article, and of course, there's a comment calling me out saying that it's not reasonably priced, and the mindset that Watch Media accepts any price as quote unquote fair is a turnoff. So that commenter's name is blah blah. So don't know if that's a message there, but hey, point taken. I think that
it's all relative.
It's all relative, and I think that we're talking about like a luxury dive watch from one of the like top 3 brands in the world. This is just in terms of like prestige and volume. We've got Rolex, Cartier, and Omega. I think like kind of like the top 3 consumer level brands anyway. And I don't know, like $10,000 for like their top of the line dive watch, in 2025 is like, I think that's normal. Like it's not like it's expensive, but I don't think it's like an obscene, statement, in 2025.
It doesn't feel like to me that pricing it high to give it more clout. A lot of brands, luxury brands, need to do this sometimes in order to sort of separate themselves and make themselves less affordable to sort of increase their prestige.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that that's being done here. I think, it's a fair price for what all other Omegas cost and what other watches cost around the same price point is what I think is a good value. But it depends on what your yardstick is. If you're comparing this to like what an Apple costs, of course it's a shitload of money,
Yes.
So pick your yardstick.
Yeah. Well, like everything else, the market will decide. We'll see.
For sure.
We'll see what these are, selling for on the pre-owned market in a year, or if they turn up, on the gray market, what they go for. It'll become clear, what people are willing to pay for these watches in due time. But just in terms of like MSRP, this seems pretty normal to me, and I just don't have that reflexive what are they thinking kind of thought when I see the price. So
same, totally.
Anyway, I'm curious.
One last thing I'll say on this as well is that I feel like this is doing just the littlest bit of fan service for Plopro fans. I feel like this is just kind of doing a little bit of that obscenely like over-engineered watch design for the sake of it kind of thing, which I like.
Yeah. So I mean, the Powerhouse is another. We didn't discuss that yet, but maybe we can kind of touch on it real briefly. That is truly their like high-end diver. Yeah. But it's not, and if Kat Childers is listening, I know she is, she'll have thoughts on this because I believe she's still currently a Ploprof owner, but it's like, that's not a consumer level. Like that's not a watch that like most people would go into a store and think like, I desire that. Like this is this is like a high end watch that like, and like a professional watch that still appeals to like a normal sort of like watch, but but it does have some of that Ploprof DNA, like because the Ploprof does have like harsher angles, and it doesn't resemble, a traditional Seamaster. It has, a completely different sort of design language to it. And this feels like a cousin of that in some ways, I think.
Exactly.
So, that's a really good point. All right. Should we move on to non-Swiss, Liam?
We should.
Okay.
This is enough Swiss talk.
Yeah. We're moving on from Switzerland for the rest of the conversation, in certain ways anyway. Listen, like we don't put a ton of importance, I think, on like country of origin on worn and wound. It's never been our thing to like, prioritize like Swiss made as a, as like a, like the platonic ideal of any watch, like we understand, of course, that like Switzerland has a proud and long watchmaking history, but you can look elsewhere. We've always looked elsewhere for, for value and for originality and watches. So this isn't like a slight on Switzerland at all. We love Switzerland, but I think it's an opportunity to kind of like highlight other countries that like make watches in various ways. Obviously, like some of the watches that we mentioned, some of the watches I'm going to mention anyway, like have Swiss movements, but they're conceived and elements of them are built in other countries. And I just sort of like, in approaching this, we each picked 3 watches, and I challenged myself to pick 3 watches that were not only not from Switzerland, but also not from Japan, and also have like a unique like a tie to their own country in some way, even if they're using components from other parts of the world. How
Yep.
did you kind of like go about thinking through this exercise?
Yeah, I didn't limit myself to brands that were entirely manufactured outside of Switzerland. I think that would have been unfair and a little limiting because while, it's kind of the same thing like being staunchly made American or whatever it is, like that's just not how the global supply chain like works. And I think it's kind of extremely unrealistic to categorize brands that only make them in the country, design and made in the country that they're from is the only sort of marker for success and sort of deciding for a watch in this kind of thought exercise. So I think, I tried to be fair in choosing something that and argue for why it will be a future icon and what makes it interesting, what makes it a watch that people should think about and should consider it a future icon as well.
Yeah. I don't know. I in my mind, these watches are iconic in their own way. I don't know that they'll necessarily be. I'm just looking at my list. I don't know that they'll necessarily be like, icons, broadly speaking. But they have like a certain. They like. I feel like they all tie really closely to their home country in some way, which is really what I was trying to identify. Like I said, we each picked 3 watches. Liam, why don't you go first? Tell me what your first pick is.
Yeah, sure thing. So my first pick was the Grand Seiko SLGA 009, the white birch, obviously from Japan. I think, this is basically the like flagship expression of Grand Seiko's modern design language of being Evolution 9 with that deeply textured white birch dial and the 9R8 spring drive 5-day movement. And I think it refines that the earlier high beat white birch, the SLGH 005, and I feel like this watch kind of crystallizes the nature of time concept in sort of one reference. And I think this is the watch that people will still talk about when they talk about Grand Seiko in 20 years when it comes to sort of dial, movement, case, language. I think this is their best, synthesis of all those things that represent Grand Seiko in the 21st century.
Yep.
I think it also, redefined expectations for non-Swiss finishing, especially in the 10K bracket. And I think, Grand Seiko should be lauded for their cultural success and sort of watch enthusiasm when it comes to dial designs. It's no longer kind of a niche thing anymore. I feel like it's something that, collectors and designers from all walks of life sort of come to expect now. And for the dials to sort of be a core component of the watch's design language and what it represents, even if it's very simple.
Yep. I think it's fitting that a Grand Seiko is the first watch we mentioned in the non-Swiss episode. I think your point about them sort of like their finishing. I think kind of like redefining what it like what finishing can accomplish outside of Switzerland and what Japanese finishing really is. I think in these watches is like very important, and that's something that frankly I think Grand Seiko's done an excellent job of like kind of teaching consumers about. If you look at, we can maybe talk about other Japanese watches that, also follow a similar tradition that Grand Seiko has like set out now for decades. These flat planes and Zaratsu polish surfaces, and something that's been repeated in Japan by other brands to some extent. So it's Grand Seiko kind of establishing its own kind of national tradition, which is, that is like iconic, in a very real sense. Obviously there's a bunch of Grand Seikos you could have picked. Were there any others that you were kind of like in the running for you? I think this particular watch I think is a great choice, but what other Grand Seikos were kind of like floating around in your mind that you might have chosen?
Good question. And I'm glad you asked, because I feel like while this is, I would argue the best representation of that. I think a really strong runner up is their new birch bark dial from the manual wind Grand Seiko from the Evolution 9 collection. I feel like is another really strong mainstay for Grand Seiko and something I think people will talk about in 20 years' time. I think it's sort of the post-modern era of Grand Seiko, if you will. And yeah, I think that's probably one of the strongest ones. And I think one of the sort of more obvious ones that I feel like has a little more cachet with regular collectors is the Shunbun.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's easily their most popular reference, maybe next to the Snowflake. I feel like even most non-watch people know what the Snowflake is, I think, if you're even remotely interested in watches. So those would be my other picks, but I still think this is the strongest one.
Yeah, no, it's a great pick. We've covered this watch pretty in depth. There's a review of it somewhere on the website. I'll find it and throw it in the show notes. But yeah, it's a wonderful watch. Definitely an iconic watch, fitting first pick, like I said. My first pick is going to go in a completely different direction. This is a watch on a much smaller scale than Grand Seiko. I'm picking from Robot Watches, based in Prague,
Nice.
the Czech Republic, the graphic analog. I went and visited the robot facilities in Prague about a year ago, and I was just so impressed with what they're able to do in their very small manufacturer just outside of Prague, about 2 hours or so outside of the city. And the watches have a ton of charm. I picked the graphic analog specifically because the dial design is based on the typeface of Prague's like public transportation, their metro system.
Oh, that's cool.
It's really cool. It's like I said, very charming. And it's really like very Prague. Like, it feels like something that is an artifact of the city, and they're very proud of the design, and I think it looks cool. And they've got a couple different dial variants. There's also like an all black one, which is a limited edition with a black coated case and a black dial that looks really, really cool. Mm-hmm. I've got a photo of that somewhere on my Instagram from my trip last year. I'll throw that on. Really one of those watches like I haven't been able to stop thinking about. But like I was just so impressed with what they're able to accomplish like in-house, on these watches. Obviously they're using sourced movements. They use Swiss movements. This one runs on a Le Juperet caliber. But, in their little manufacturer, they're doing like a lot of dial work, in-house, and all the design work. And like they're painting dials and treating the aluminum and doing case finishing. And, it was just really impressive. And it kind of, we talk about it a lot on the website, and it's something that I think we all kind of like know intellectually, but it's good to be reminded of the fact that like, even if you're sourcing stuff from other countries, from Switzerland or Japan or China or wherever, there's a lot of opportunity if you're, ambitious enough and creative enough to make something your own, in your space, in this case, in the Czech Republic. And that's something that we try to identify with, with other micro brands and small, independents. And I think it's just important to, understand that, some brands are really kind of like doing a lot of their own work, even if they're, getting stuff shipped to them, and they're, kind of like altering it after the fact. I think like that still counts, so to speak. Like, we should give them credit for that and for doing the things that they don't necessarily have to do. There's real watchmaking going on here, and it is like kind of like specific to this brand and specific to the Czech Republic. And Robot's just a really cool brand, and brand that I just wanted to give a little shine to on this episode, because the Czech Republic is not a traditional watchmaking hub, although there is a watchmaking history there. So I think it's just nice to kind of like remind folks that like watchmaking happens all over the world in different ways.
That's a great pick. I love that. I think it's really, really modern, very reminiscent of sort of, I think, Bauhaus and sort of postmodernism in Europe, especially Germany as well. Those kinds of, very modern looking apartment blocks that they build, and sort of very, very stark difference to the sort of traditional architecture of those countries and those towns as well. So this is cool. Kind of, it's the Czech Republic's mundane watch, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. And another thing I'll point out is if you look at Robot's catalog, of watches, all of the watches look a little different. Like they don't have a lot of like coherence from one watch to another, which is normally we celebrate, like that sort of design coherence. Like we talk about Ming, for example. You can recognize a Ming, from across the room, regardless of, whether it's a, like first gen Ming or a newer release, it has this like distinct Ming like DNA. You can't really say the same about Robot, because they're really taking like very specific aspects of Czech culture and aspects of like Prague in particular, and kind of like interpreting them into a watch design. So all their watches kind of like look a little bit different and have like very different character to them. But I think that serves them because as I pointed out, the Czech Republic is not a watchmaking hub, and it's an opportunity for the brand to kind of like teach people about Prague and about the Czech Republic and about their brand and what's important to them. And so I would encourage people to kind of like check out their range of watches. If the graphic analog is not to your taste, there might be something else that appeals to you, because there's quite a range in their in their lineup. So yeah, the graphic analog from Robot. What's your next pick, Liam?
My next pick is the Baltic MR01, the micro rotor. I think this to me is a future icon because it is a brand that kind of bucked the integrated bracelet sports watch trend, in sort of 2021 by going, full dress, like went all in on sort of dress watches initially. Obviously they've got a lot of really cool sports watches, but I think this really cemented Baltic as like a brand to look at and pay attention to. They kind of sold out rapidly and took Instagram by storm. I think, it being sort of in the middle of COVID really helped as well. I think a lot of people were spending a lot of time online. So I think they used that to their advantage, indirectly or directly. And, they cemented themselves, I think, as a very design-forward French micro brand. And I think the other thing that they should be sort of applauded for, and something I think people will talk about in the future as well, is that, they, like, micro rotor watches basically didn't exist at the price point that they're selling at before. Like, I feel like they kind of created a whole sort of category of dress watches that you would only find in maybe like a Patek Philippe, 3, 4, 5 times the cost. So, I think, an ultra thin 36 millimeter micro rotor dress watch with, Breguet numerals, at the price point is phenomenal. I think that to me is the sign of an icon to me.
Yeah. I like that watch a lot. I like what Baltic is doing a lot. They're part of this sort of like resurgence in French, French watchmaking that, Kate Bazemore actually wrote a really fun article last year, about that very topic. French brands kind of like on the rise. So we can link to that. I like that. I like that MR line quite a bit. And, I like that Baltic has, kind of like transitioned from being, when they started, like they made kind of like, riffs on vintage watches, like almost exclusively. And like they still do that, but like I feel like they've gotten a little bit more adventurous and just like play in different genres a little bit more easily now. And like this MR series is definitely part of that. It's a really cool watch. If folks haven't like had a chance to try these watches on, like they wear incredibly well. They're just a really like nice compact size. And there's a certain novelty too, and having a micro rotor movement at that price point. It's just it's a very cool thing.
Totally.
Yeah, that's a good pick. I'll go right into my next pick. I think this watch is already an icon. This watch is from Germany. It's the Nomos Tangenta. I think that Nomos is a brand that like, kind of like Grand Seiko, like we sort of have to mention, in this, in this episode. You can sort of like take your pick. There's a bunch of different, Nomos references that, could be mentioned. I picked the Tangenta because it, like, to me, that is like the iconic, like Nomos design. It sort of is when I close my eyes and picture a Nomos, it's not something I do all the time, but like if I were to do that, like I think that the Tangenta would be the one that sort of like pops into mind. It's sort of like just describes the like the ethos of the brand. I think like sort of like German design, Bauhaus influenced, very minimal in terms of the case architecture and the dial work. They've done so many cool, like, limited editions and subsequent, versions and colorways of this watch. It comes in a huge range now of sizes with, their hand wound movement and automatic movements and different complications. And it's really sort of like the watch that I think has sort of like, it's like an umbrella over the entire brand. So I love the Nomos Tangenta. I own a different Nomos, but I have owned the Tangenta in the past. It's just a wonderful kind of like, it's an everyday watch for people who like, go to an office every day and don't
Mhm.
swim every day, basically. It's that's kind of how I look at it. It's
Totally.
somewhere between like a dress watch and something like a little bit more sort of like sporty. But it's a watch that can easily be dressed up or worn very casually, very versatile. Yeah, I love the Nomos Tangenta. Do you have any thoughts on Nomos or the Tangenta specifically?
Huge fan of Nomos. I've visited their manufacturer a number of times, and I'm always delighted every time I get to visit both their design office and sort of their manufacturing plants as well. There's just such a beautiful, quiet sort of German attention to detail, and I love that about. And I think that's very well represented in the watches that they create. And I feel like the Tangente is definitely one of Nomos's best examples of their style, their taste, their approach to watchmaking. And I think that watch against maybe, I'd say the Club is probably the next closest, is probably the most approachable for non-watch people as well. I feel like a square watch is very, very approachable. I think it's not too loud. It's not too bold. So I think it's a great gateway watch to a lot of watches. And I would always recommend, a Tangente or a Club to someone who's looking to buy their first watch.
Yeah, the Club's another really good one. And Nomos is great. They're they were sort of like a forum darling, like when I was sort of like coming of age, and getting like really interested in watches, very under the radar, and like they're no longer under the radar. Like people know Nomos at this point. Like seeing the growth of the brand has been really, just a very impressive thing to and we sometimes complain, like we want to see them do something different. We want to see like some new stuff from Nomos. They do iterate a lot on the same references, but like the iterations are really good. Like they're always like they're always like making good choices and I can't say that like they're not stumbling. They're just kind of like plodding along, and I think that's like the sign of a brand that's like set for longevity. Which I think is an important thing. Like I feel like they'll be around for a long time.
They'll be fine.
Yeah, I think so. All right, Liam, we're on your third and final pick. What have you got? What had to close us out here?
So this is a watch that I've always wanted to own, but just never got around actually pulling the trigger and finding one that I really, really wanted. But I think is an exceptional brand worthy of being a future icon, because I think they set the blueprint for serious micro-brand sports watches, between the 2010s and the 2020s. And I would say that is the Helios C. I think, they've been a micro-brand outright. I think, a 41 millimeter cleanly designed sports dive watch that sort of mixes vintage cues with ultra-modern execution. The demand is consistently outstrips their supply, and so their secondhand prices always stay relatively high as well. It's a beautiful watch. It has a beautiful silhouette. I think it is a great representation of Canada's innovation when it comes to watches, not typically having a watchmaking history, a storied watchmaking history like Switzerland. And I think it's all the more impressive because I think Switzerland has a lot of advantages having watchmaking so closely tied to their cultural identity. It's something that people consider as a career path in high school. That's just not the same in just about any other country, I think. And I hope that changes, because I think the more people in that space and making it a career pathway early on, I think is a really important thing if we want to see watches stay relevant and accessible in the future. So I think, Helios Seaforth is doing the Seaforth is doing a good job of that. And, I think it could sit easily alongside mainstream Swiss pieces in a decade and not look dated. And I'd love to own one at some point, and I hope I do.
Yeah. Glad we got some Canadian representation in there. Helios is a really cool brand. Another brand that was sort of like a forum darling at a time. And, I think that they have like this almost like cult-like following.
They do,
and,
yeah.
And it just like it sustains them. And you don't hear as much about like new Helios releases, but they're still kind of like plugging along. Like I said, that fan base kind of like has been sustaining them now for years. And Seaforth is just fantastic all-purpose watch. It's
Yep.
really good, and I think it's a good example too. It's sort of like this sort of reminds me a little bit of my robot watch pick. It's a watch that's, it uses sourced components from other places, but it's still like distinctly of the place where, like founder is based, and like it feels very much of a piece with like the watch culture in Canada. Vancouver, I think, is where they're based, if I'm not mistaken. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong there, but yeah, I think that that's a really, really good pick, and accessible too. Like, in spite of the, these watches kind of trading for around, retail price on the secondhand market, which is a real sign of strength for the brand. Like, this is a watch that, people can pick up, which is a good thing. My final pick is not a watch that people can just pick up. It's the Jan Shapiro Resurgence, which of course is an American-made watch by Jan Shapiro, Josh Shapiro's brand, based in California. Thought it'd be good to pick an American brand. We've talked a lot about American watchmaking this year. There have been some kind of important developments in American watchmaking throughout the course of the year. It's one of the big stories of 2025. And the Resurgence is like an incredibly important piece, in the history of American watchmaking and in the history of Shapiro's own brand. And for folks who aren't familiar, we'll of course link to the story in the show notes. But this is, essentially a watch that is almost entirely made in the United States. It doesn't qualify for the like made in USA stamp, on it because of our country's, in my opinion, kind of arcane rules around what can and can't be labeled as made in America. But Josh and his team do an incredible amount of work, in their workshop in California, from machining the cases to finishing the movements, designing the movements, and it's all done at just an incredibly high level. I've had a chance to see a few of these watches, in person at trade shows, and most recently at Geneva Watch Days earlier this summer. I got to see some of Shapiro's pieces, and they're just like really, really impressive. And just beautifully made. They really do feel like handmade watches, because they are, and knowing that they're handmade and conceived and built in the United States is just it's just really special. So this is sort of, there's other great examples of watches that are either made in America to some extent, to varying degrees, but this is sort of like most made in America watch in a lot of ways, just in terms of it's like what's actually produced here and its opulence. Like there's nothing that like kind of approaches it in terms of its like the maximal kind of qualities of it.
Yeah. I say the closest thing would be maybe RGM, maybe.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, I love RGM, but I don't think that they come close to the level, like to that opulence of like the Resurgence. There's like a humbleness to RGM that I think is actually really appealing. Shapiro feels like he's flexing a little bit with the Resurgence, which I think is warranted. I think that that's like, it's meant to be an example of like what can be done in this country, given, like not unlimited resources, but like all of the opportunities, that are afforded to
totally.
him. So
I think it's extremely important what he's doing, and I'm glad that he's doing what he's doing.
Yeah. It's it's a very cool piece. I would encourage people to check out our article on the Resurgence. Also, David Bader's interview with Josh Shapiro that we published earlier this year. Zach Weiss's review of the most recent Shapiro release. His name escapes me of the specific watch, but we'll link to it in the show notes. Important brand doing really cool work. So yeah, that does it. Those are our non-Swiss picks. I feel like we have quite the range there, Liam.
That's a pretty good range, I think.
Yeah, pretty good range. So thank you, Liam, for coming on the podcast and going through some non-Swiss watches with me and talking about some Swiss watches too at the top of the show. We covered the entire world today in horology. So always appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
And to the listeners, we appreciate you listening as always. It's great that you join us each week, and we will be back next week with another all new episode. Until then, take care.